Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments. Okay. Hi, my name is Maris Kreisman, and I run events and marketing at McNally Jackson. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event for the store. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming days and weeks. I'm adding more every day, so please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming up soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're so glad that even though we can't be in the same room right now, we're still able to host events this way during this difficult time. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to again admitting customers into our 4 locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. I'll post a link to buy the new issue of Freeman's from us on our website, right into the Zoom chat. And I will also post a link to our events fund because we would really appreciate any donation you can spare. And now I will stop begging because we are here to celebrate an international launch of the latest installment from a powerful force in the literary world, says the LA Times. In this issue, Freeman's turns to one of the greatest elevating forces of life, love. I'm so happy to introduce John Friedman, who was the editor of Granta until 2013. His books include How to Read a Novelist, Tales of Two Cities, Tales of Two Americas, and Maps, his debut collection of poems. He's executive editor at Literary Hub and teaches at the New School and New York University. His work has appeared in the New Yorker and the Paris Review and has been translated into 20 languages. Welcome.
Thank you, Maris, for having me, and thank you all for coming before the end of the day. I should shame you for clocking off at 6 p.m. That's one of the only good things that have come from this total shit show of a year, is I think an awareness that our time is it's not infinite, and we can spend it together rather than beavering our ways into computers, into work that could probably be put off till tomorrow. I'm so happy to be joined tonight by 3 writers who will have circadian hangovers tomorrow as a result of their participation in this event. The event is to celebrate the launch of this, but Freeman's really exists to kind of showcase the work of writers that I love. And for a long time, I feel like we've gotten sidetracked in literary discussions about what really matters in writing. And when I finish a book that's moved me or changed me or agitated me, it has had an impact on my body, the way that love does. And it often deals with love, whether it's family love or romantic love or love of a place, love of a time. And I think in this present era, when the airways are so pumped full of the opposite of love, it's a good time to focus on what writing can say about love, and how we tell our stories of love. And the writers who are here with me tonight are brilliant at doing that, from Mariana Enriquez to Andrew Mcmillan to Gunnhild Øyehaug. Mariana, you might know, was born in Buenos Aires and published her first book at age 21. So those of you who are 22, you can all just break your violins right now. Rip off! But she's most known now as a writer of short stories. Things We Lost in the Fire is a book you should be reading right now if you're not going to read love. Because if you want a voice to hold you and to scare you, to tell you stories that are dark and deal with the trauma of war years, and that show the way that darkness is inscribed on a woman's body in a place like Argentina, which is still dealing with the years that she writes of. These are stories for you. They're hilarious and moving They speak right at you. She's the author of several other books, including a new story collection called The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. You can tell she has a Gothic elbow right into the storytelling mode. And she's also the author of a book-length nonfiction work on Tolina Ocampo, who's having a bit of a resurgence here. We might get to talking about her later on. Mariana is joining us from Buenos Aires. Hi, Mariana.
Hi, how you doing? Hello,
It's really,
everybody.
really good to see you.
Thanks.
I'm going to introduce people as we go, but I want to ask you a question first.
Okay.
How have the past 8 months, have they made you think any differently about love, about its dependency on proximity or touch or anything like that?
Yeah, because I mean, we had a very strict lockdown here at the very beginning, and then it kind of eased. But I work from my house, and I spend it all with my husband, and we are not used to being together that long. And like normal life is me out. He is very active, goes out a lot, and we would see each other at night. And, you know, after 2 months of this, I was like, I think we're going to crash. Like, this is not going to work out because that's not how our relationship is. Also, we are not, I'm Argentinian, he's Australian. We met when he was doing a world tour on a bike. So he's kind of a bit, he had been in that trip for 6 years. So he's a bit of a character. And, you know, having him locked with me in the house, I'm very used to being locked, you know, the books and, you know, we're totally different. And we haven't had a fight once. You know, we take care of each other. We organized like almost perfect, all things that we don't do usually. And I realized something that I really didn't expect of this relationship is that we work out very nicely under pressure, and we are very committed in taking care of each other. That is not, wasn't that obvious, I think. You might say, well, but that's a basic of a relationship of being together. Well, not really. I mean, it's not, you don't know that until you have to go through a circumstance like this. So yeah, it made me reflect a lot, appreciate him more, realize we're not children anymore, and realize maybe we can grow old together, which is kind of, I mean, I don't want to grow old at all, but you know, maybe growing old with him would be nice. And these are kind of, you know, I grew up, I think. And growing up with someone you love was not something I was expecting to happen. I thought life was going to be faster, and suddenly it stopped and made me realize this. So it's kind of nice, but it's kind of melancholic, or maybe I'm just melancholic myself.
Mm. We'll come back to that because Mariana's piece is a short essay about a kind of meteor-like love affair she had with a man in France. And the end of that affair is sort of the beginning of the rest of her life in a way. But first I want to go to Andrew Mcmillan, who's one of Britain and the UK's most exciting young poets. His debut collection, Physical, won the Guardian First Book Prize and the Somerset Maugham Award. And if you want a Cavafy without the Doppler wave of time, Andrew Mcmillan is sort of the guy for you. I don't know if that's a good description, Andrew, of what you think you're writing.
That feels nice. I'll take that. Yeah.
But this book was published in languages around the world, from Norwegian, where I met you, and at Lillehammer, to I saw you at a festival online from afar in Malta. Is that true?
I think, yeah.
His latest book is Playtime, which won the Polar Prize, and he's a senior lecturer at the Manchester Writing School at Manchester Metropolitan University. one of the things, Andrew, I love about your poems is this rich and kind of forceful physicality with this also tenderness and vulnerability that you inscribe into the erotic. And you know, all these things have changed, except in the last 8 months. But it hasn't changed that much if from the very beginning those things were dangerous or they had elements of risk. I wonder if you can talk about what it's like to sort of be working in that mode, and then for the rest of the world to slightly catch up to you to some degree.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think part of what I've always been interested in, as you say, John, is that sense of the vulnerability of the flesh. And all it is a kind of project really is that you take a kind of erotics of poetry, which would generally be a male gaze onto women that's often a kind of hunter-prey kind of mentality, kind of seeking the deer or whatever that is. And if you turn a male erotic gaze onto other men, not even necessarily in a homosexual way, just in a homosocial way, you see the fragility and the kind of fear of that flesh and of men, I think. And so I've always been fascinated by that fragility, I guess, but also of transience, which is something else that I think I've always been fascinated by, almost like you always get in Virginia Woolf novels, where people just miss each other slightly, where they kind of almost do, but they can't quite. And there's something about a world that we have to live in now where touch isn't allowed, or touch is kind of the thing to be afraid of, where passing each other in the street or kind of even meeting up with friends, you get this real vivid sense of that kind of force field that can't be crossed, that force field that can't be kind of moved between. And I think certainly the way that I always view a lot of the relationships I have with my friends or with my family or with kind of partner is there's a sense in which, you know, is someone a kind of close friend, or are they a potential partner or kind of an ex-partner that you maybe still are in touch with? And somehow that force field of social distance where you can't touch them, it vibrates then, it vibrates in the air, that inability to kind of reach across that. And so that, I guess, is something that I'm fascinated with as well. But I mean, as a history of poetry, not something I ever lived through and could write about, but it's also fascinating to think of, I think, in terms of the history of poetry that came out of the AIDS crisis and poetry that came out from gay poets in the 80s and 90s, and how much of that was about a kind of fear of something that couldn't be seen or even understood, and poets who survived that. So people like Tom Gunn or Mark Doty, who become then poets of witness, which also becomes a kind of another really important role then as the poet in a community, as a witness and a kind of contemporary historian almost, I guess, to what's happening in the landscape.
Yeah, the last couple weeks since I've been back in New York, I've been watching films from the late 70s and early 80s. Partly because I reread Smash Cut, this memoir by Brad Gooch, who's a wonderful biographer of Frank O'Hara and Flannery O'Connor and Rumi. And he also translated some of Rumi's poems. And I think I started watching them because I moved to New York in the mid 1990s when New York was still coming through the throes of the worst part of the AIDS crisis. And so neighborhoods had a kind of hollowness that was created by loss. And it's happening again now, but for different reasons. And to watch films that were made in New York in the late 70s and early 80s is to watch a city about to go through something that they couldn't imagine. And some of the films are even sort of hinting at this, but can't direct that. And I wonder if, as a poet, you do have to create social space in your poems. And I wonder if, the way that you write public space in your poems now will change as a result of that vibration that you're describing, but also I guess a kind of fear You know, because right now the way that the city has changed, New York I'm talking about, there's the hollowness and the emptiness has a vibration of fear. You know, what you described is longing and sort of physical contact. But
I mean, what it's done for me as well is, because I live in Manchester, but about sort of 10 minutes outside, and it's not, it's in the kind of part of Manchester that's not been gentrified at all. So it's kind of in the kind of old northern kind of industrial part of the city. And because when we were locked down kind of very heavily in March and April, just spent a lot of time walking around this part of the city in a way that I never had, and looking at a space that you can see the skyscrapers that are being built still constantly on the horizon. You can sort of glimpse the city, but here it feels like a very different space. It's still kind of very post-industrial. It's still very poor. There are still buildings that they say they're going to make into new apartments and flats, but they never quite finish them. And so it's been interesting kind of walking around this kind of as yet undefined space that now actually has a chance. If people aren't going into the city, maybe this sort of place has a chance to revive itself, and more people, you know, that local high street maybe has a chance to revive itself. But it's been interesting, I guess, being forced to exist on that periphery, and the city being somewhere else that feels more unsafe in a way that it hasn't been before.
No. Gunnhild Øyehaug, I want to talk to you before we tip into the 1 o'clock hour in Bergen. Thank you so much for dialing in. I wonder if, as Andrew and I were speaking, Andrew, you know, the way that space in the city has changed, and Mariana about the intimacy of sort of indoor life with a partner. If you have any observations about how your notion of love has changed in the last 8 months. One of the things I like very much about Gunnhild's work is the way it sort of brilliantly, constantly interrogates the way a story is told. Sometimes a love story. And the story that she has in this issue begins in the mouth of a professor and then falls into the body of a student watching who grows old, and then you realize she's been telling this story to her students on the last day of her work, and then she goes home and buys a plant for her daughter. And it's a sort of typical Gunnhild Øyehaug move where it threads this needle so delicately, you know, through a very thin looking glass that you don't even realize that what you're witnessing is a kind of Borgesian experiment in narration. And she's the author of Wait Blink, which is a kind of the anti-rom-com novel that you may not realize you've always been wanting, and a book of stories called Knots, both of which I think are brilliantly translated by Kari Dixon, who I saw is in attendance. And she has a new book called Presens Maskin, which in Ironies of Speaking is coming out next year. So it's in the future tense. But Gunnhild, did anything Andrew or Mariana say jive with you, or are you on a different plane when it comes to love these days?
A completely different planet. No, I recognize both descriptions, but I live in a small place on the outskirts of Bergen with my family. I have a husband and 2 children, and you know, during lockdown we had to have homeschooling, and we were only allowed to be together with, I think the kids were allowed to have 1 friend each. And my son was a bit late looking for friends. I think he had a cold or something like that in the beginning, so he was kind of last. So everyone else were taken. He didn't have any friends for like 2 months, only us. So then I actually discovered the joy of not for my own part, but for his part, for a kind of online playing, that he could keep in touch with his friends online. So that made me kind of realize the advantages of social media, not necessarily on social media, but the wonderful thing which is called internet, which I've been kind of hostile to. So at some aspects of it has been quite difficult. But then that was a lesson for me. But I think the worst part was that I was cut off from my hometown and my parents and my sister and brother, who I couldn't visit. And I've always been very homebound, and I love going to see them, and not being able to visit them was just terrible. And talking to them on FaceTime and feeling like I was 13 years old and on a camp I didn't want to be in. I wanted to go home. So that was really a new and strange experience. And I've been thinking a lot about how privileged I am to have people around me. I think that this must have been a very hard time for people who are alone, and that the solitude has been so powerful, I think, during these months. So I've been thinking a lot about actually solitude and loneliness too.
I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up before I ask you something about your story, which I adore. One of the great old Norwegian short storytellers, God, I'm forgetting his name. He's about 88. He's sort of your Alice Munro, but a lot of his short stories are about a kind of lonely old man on a hill. What was his name?
Askildsen.
Yes.
I'm guessing.
Yes.
Yeah, Kjell Askildsen. Thank you, Mariana.
I would say Kjell Askildsen, and he
Yeah.
would say it the proper way. Brilliant short story writer, but reading those stories, in the United States, we think of Raymond Carver and what we talk about when we talk about love. You might think of, I don't know, Tony K. Bambara, who wrote really great stories about love, Sandra Cisneros. What does it mean when a figure of that scale writes so many stories that are about loneliness? Like this sort of drop of loneliness planted sort of in the heart of literary culture, or am I missing a kind of warm vein of love stories coming from Norway?
Tough question. And I have to kind of admit that I haven't really read Kjell Askildsen that much. I have read, my inspiration come from different Norwegian short story writers, mainly Tarjei Vesaas, which is a brilliant writer. But he is also writing about solitude and snow, solitude and snow. So maybe I think maybe solitude and the coldness is a very typical Norwegian theme, actually. And I'm not very surprised if you go around the country, you see that we have a lot of space to be lonely in. A lot of us live in very small communities. So that there's a lot of room for just going around in your own thoughts. But there's also there's another tradition in the Norwegian short storytelling, which comes from or he made this space for himself. He's called Hans Habenster, and he wrote I think he said it himself, in opposition to Kjell Askildsen's stories. He wrote surrealist, very funny, very brilliant short stories. But I also read him quite late. So neither of those two guys have had so much impact on my own writing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think I went to Virginia Woolf straight away.
Right. Well, I can see some of that acrobaticness in your narration. I hope I haven't misdescribed your story, which begins in a lecture hall, and a visiting writer is telling a story about a person who goes out in the snow with a dog and is briefly, suddenly, tangibly happy, content. And then at the very end of this passage, the person who you don't realize is reading it suddenly says, "And I was very happy with how I wrote that." it breaks the spell, and we're suddenly in the lecture hall, and the writer who's been reading the story is talking to students, and one of them in particular starts to ask him questions, and they wind up outside talking, and they have a encounter, which leads to a many-year-long encounter, in which she's sort of the older man and she's the younger woman. And at that moment, the story performs this incredible Orlando-like hinge, where rather than engage in retelling that story, you flip the story entirely inside out and hand it to the woman, who takes the story the rest of the way home. And I saw this and read this as a kind of rewriting. And I just wondered what the impetus for the story was, and if you see it as a rewriting, or see it as a rewriting of Pygmalion.
Yeah, well, no, I don't. To answer quite bluntly, I don't see it as a rewriting of the Pygmalion, because I really don't think, I'm kind of leafing through my story now to just kind of try to remember what it's about. But I don't think, I think the beginning, which you very accurately described, it's told in the first person, and you're supposed to believe when you're reading it that you're going to read a story in the first person, and then suddenly, as you say, it shifts in the end, and he says, and I liked the way I'd written this, intimate and honest, and I liked the fact that Sonia was named after a variety of apple. And so he's kind of commenting on his own text, and this is the trick he does to show his class a way of turning a text around in the last minute. But that's also mimics the way the short story is told, because that's when the story shifts from a first person narrative into omnipotent narrator. And so for me, it's just these two layers, I would call them, of narration exist at the same time, so that he doesn't really have, I mean, if it was a rewriting of the Pygmalion, then he would have created something that would come to life. But then this is something that's alive. You can't really decide which of them came first. They're actually at the same, kind of on the same level. And that's also, I think, a lot of the idea. That's how this story came about from my own part. It's when I had written the first short story, which was actually just like that. It ended with him saying, and I liked the way I'd written this. But it wasn't done. I felt that there was something missing. So I just put it aside. And then suddenly I could see that he was standing in front of the class and kind of reading his story. And then all the other shifts, because there are 2 or 3 other major shifts in the narration place. And I knew that the young woman who he falls in love with and who falls in love with him is the one who's going to be the narrator in the end when she's 17. And all this happens in just a few pages, and you know, their relationship happens actually not during several years, but only a couple of weeks, and she manages to get pregnant, and he doesn't know, because the short story just kind of drowns him, because I think the short story didn't really quite, or the short story, which is also a character in the story, because the story reacts to what happens. At one point, the story is actually surprised with what happens. But you know, the male author is actually just drowned because it's convenient for the story, because it's easier to tell the story from her perspective when he is gone. So yeah.
It's funny that I thought he was alive for years.
But he was alive, but he was I think it's kind of I think there's a lapse. There's a huge lapse in the short story there, which is just not, I haven't really done anything with it. Let's just not talk about it.
Yeah, you kill him, he's diving in the Mediterranean, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question, Mariana, because you often put some of your characters through the paces. Sorry, I'm trying to turn on a light. There we go. And we were talking about sort of rewriting a little bit here, or respinning, and I wonder, if you could talk to me a little bit about the love stories that you grew up with that were kind of in the air around you, because I love the way that your short stories enfold some of the tones and moves of myth and fairy tale, and Gothic horror stories, and into their kind of narrative fabric. Oh wait, you're muted. Oh, how do we unmute?
Thanks. I don't know why I was muted. Was thinking about this, and it's a strange one, because I think the love stories that have, in a way, scarred me, because I think that's more like it, are the Bronte sisters books. Those were the very first books I read in general, and they were all absolutely over the top love stories, and especially Wuthering Heights, I guess. And I think I've been writing Heathcliff since then, demon lover. And it's, I don't know if it's a very good model, but it's kind of my sentimental education, let's say. The other thing is that in Latin American literature, or I mean in the Argentinian literature, in the literature in my language as in Spanish, and in my language as in Argentinian, you don't have that many love things. Or the ones you have are intensely misogynist, especially from the best writers. Like there's a writer I really like, that's Juan Carlos Onetti. He's from Uruguay, that's the country across Buenos Aires, basically. I really like him. He's like a totally bleak Faulkner, if you can imagine something like that. And gray, but he hates women. He hates women. He even has a short story about a woman that sends dirty pictures to a man to take money from him, and he ends up killing himself or something. And this story is a very famous story here, and it's called The Most Feared Hell. So, and I don't know, there's things like that. And then you have, for example, Garcia Marquez. That is something that you read when you're young and stuff. And there's some tenderness there too, but there's also like Love in the Times of Cholera. There's a very, very young girl with an old man. So it's difficult to relate. Many of the women writers were more, Silvino Campo, for example, but others were more inclined to more surreal kind of things. And of course, Borges doesn't have love at all, or sex, or anything that could, involve his feelings or body, because he didn't like that. So it's, as far as that, it's strange what I'm going to say, but I think in the late 80s, when I was in my late teens, I started reading American literature about the AIDS pandemic. I was, very impressed when Andrew talked about that. And I think those books, even when there wasn't specifically about love, they were about love. They were about care, they were about community, many of them, and poetry, and double lives. And there's writers, maybe they are not, there are not some of the more, punk stuff that I really like. Like I really like I got somehow some memoir of David Wagner-Owicz for some reason, and it was amazing. But I remember reading A House at the End of the World by Michael Cunningham. And I think for the first time I read something that more or less resembled the kind of family and love with friends and lovers that I was kind of doing, or my friends were doing. So it's a strange one. Afterwards, I met and I read a lot of literature in my language that deal with love, but this is, the first things that you read somehow are in your, I don't know, you can really get rid of that in your literature, because those are the things that you read that, made you a writer in a way. So it was a strange mix of late 80s, mostly gay American writers, uh, the Bronte sisters, and the realization that the literature that I read in my language had a problem with women. And, even when it was very romantic, it was like too much, not, I mean, I'm probably being unfair, but this is more my recollection as a young reader than the reality of that literature. So yeah, more or less trying to answer.
Your love stories, or your stories in general, I think are just perfect vehicles of escalation. One of the stories of yours that I published in a previous issue of Freeman's concerns a woman who becomes kind of obsessed with men with erratic heartbeats, and about her sort of quest to find someone that has the kind of perfectly erratic heartbeat. And she eventually finds a terminal patient, and she starts to both give him cocaine and then proceeds to kind of fuck him to death.
Yeah.
Which feels like a really brilliant parallel of obsession. And I wonder if you can talk about obsession and love, like where you find can you have obsession within love, or is obsession an escalation that eventually burns down love?
I don't think it's exactly love, but it's a close relative. I think you can have a very, I don't know who's the feeling of love, especially at the beginning, is to me, is very, very close to feeling crazy. And if something goes too intense in those first couple of, in the first couple of whatever it is for you, days, months, it really depends, that crazy part of it. I think anything can happen. I think that in that first meeting of the mind and the flesh and the obsession with the other person, that can be healthy and then develop something else, or can be absolutely insane, because sometimes it is. On those very first encounters, you are like a match, it just takes very little to make a flame, and eventually a big fire. So to me, they are close relatives. I don't think obsession is a healthy part of love, but I'm not, I'm not the kind of person or writer either that would dismiss that and only write about love in a very safe way. I recognize that in love there's very unsafe places you can go, and it's a very inflammable and dangerous feeling too. Can be cozy, and there's beauty in that, and you can write about that, but that other part, it's very interesting to me. That story strangely came from reading basically decadent writers, French decadent writers, Rachilde, people like that. Rachilde, I think she has a story that inspired me in a way. Rachilde, one of those, I can't remember, the Nerval, I can't remember which one of all the crazy French decadent people. But one of them has a story of getting married to a person that has TB, I think, for the joy of watching her or him. I can't remember if it's a man or a woman. I'm distorted like that sometimes. For the joy of seeing her or him wasting away. So it's more in love with death and decadence than with the person itself. And that things happen too. Sometimes you fall in love with a trait in the other person that it's that could be very, very strange and peculiar. So yes, I'm very interested in that. And I'm not, you could say from a life perspective, maybe that's not love, and I hope that doesn't happen to you. But from a more literature perspective, and in some phases of life that are wilder and crazier, those things happen, and those things interest me. How far you can go.
Andrew, I'd like to ask you a question now. Your poem in the issue is a 7-part rewriting of Matthew Bourne's, is it Matthew Bourne?
Yeah.
His reinterpretation of Swan Lake. And I'm curious what drew you to it, and it's very different from your other work, and I wonder why, because it diffuses person-to-person interaction. It sort of is a lyric subterfuge, if you will. You can't address a single person when there's multiple people. Anyway, I wonder if you could talk about the why you wanted to do this, and whether you are attracted to the dangers that Mariana talked about.
I think so. I mean, I think on a broad level, what I'm really attracted to in poetry is to go back to moments that occurred when one didn't have the language to explain what they were or what they meant, and to somehow try and re-articulate them with a different eye. And so Playtime, the second book that you mentioned, is really about adolescence and childhood, and me kind of realizing now that I knew I was gay when I was maybe 4 or 5, but I didn't know what the word, the first time I heard the word gay was when someone called it me in school as an insult. And so what happens if that adult now at 30 odd goes back into that childhood and tries to kind of re-inhabit it? And with this poem Swan that you mentioned, it's radically different really to anything I've ever written before, which is why I was kind of really excited to have it in the issue. And if people haven't seen Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake, it's this kind of wonderfully queer reimagining of the ballet where the kind of chorus of swan dancers are male swans, the kind of antagonist is a male swan, the black swan's the male swan. And it really, to me, my interpretation of when I saw it was it's about queerness, but it's about mental health as well. So it's about a kind of mental trauma that comes out of a kind of unaccepted queerness. And so I just saw the ballet one evening with my family and was just kind of beguiled by it, and it lodged itself in my head. And I kept listening to the soundtrack, the kind of Tchaikovsky soundtrack, over and over again, and was almost writing to it in a way that I've never written to music before. And I wanted to go back to a kind of moment of mental trauma, of kind of mental unrest that a lot of my new work is dealing with. And that I didn't have a language to articulate at the time, because at the time you just kind of survive something and live through it, and think, well, what happens if you overlay this kind of language of what happens in this ballet and the language of the swan? If you overlay that onto this past experience, do you find a new way to articulate it? And I think particularly with love poetry, I think very little good poetry comes out of that kind of spontaneous overflow notion, that thing of just kind of, I'm in love and this is the poem and you're so beautiful. I think oftentimes the most interesting poetry, certainly to me, comes of just living the experience without thinking about it. And this is something I have to say to students all the time. Students are often very interested in theorizing their own experience in life. They want to sit and kind of ponder it. And I always want to say to them in the most ethical way possible to just go out and live it and make the mistakes and fall in love and fall out of love and etc. And afterwards, we find the language to re-articulate it in a way that might redeem it, or someone might find it useful. And so I guess in this poem, it was that trying to overlay that language of the ballet back onto this past experience and just see if in any way that made it more understandable to me, that made it more useful in any way. And it's a poem, I guess, I couldn't sit down and try and write that poem again. It's just one of those moments that comes out of a very certain moment in time when things kind of coalesce together, which is why I think it is so strange compared to a lot of other stuff I've written before.
I think what you just said is really fascinating about the need, especially within love, but just in writing in general, to get out in front of the desire to conceptualize experience. Yeah. Because I think as readers, we often encounter texts and mold them to ourselves by turning them into concepts of an experience, when in fact the reason they operate on us is by the way they touch the senses. And I wonder if you can just speak a tiny bit more about growing up reading love poems yourself, and if there was any, period or any writer that you fell into where you felt not at home, but at least where you didn't have to do a lot of conceptual work to find yourself a space.
I mean, strangely, Tom Gunn was the poet that did that for me. So when I came out at 16 to my parents, they gave me a copy of Tom Gunn's collected poems and said, I think you should read this. And there's something about Tom Gunn, and the reason he's not kind of as well known as he should be on either side of the Atlantic is because he's kind of too formal for the English and too formal for the Americans, but too kind of wild for the English. And so he kind of falls somewhere in the middle of the ocean. But there was something in Tom Gunn where at 16, there was a life that I could glimpse that was maybe possible. And it was the first time that I'd seen just that kind of queer life or queer democracy of kind of sexual community that he was fascinated by in the 70s, kind of articulated in poetry. And I'd read Philip Larkin and I'd read the war poets and things like that. And that had really been my education in poetry. And Tom Gunn, it was suddenly just that glimpse that life was worthy of literature, which I think is really important. And I've been thinking a lot about this during the pandemic. We've seen a lot of people kind of go into poetry in a way they might not normally, or certainly in this country, poetry is incredibly marginalized as an art form. But if people know you're a poet, they'll say, I'm going to a wedding or a funeral. Have you got a poem I could read? So it still occupies this kind of very high status within our culture, even though it's very marginalized. And so there's something about the power of saying, not even of just seeing oneself reflected back. In Gunn, it wasn't I ever wanted that life. It was just a glimpse of a life that might be possible. But I think just knowing that kind of queerness was worthy of literature was really important. That notion that it might be worthy of that heightened space of a poem, as I kind of could grasp that at 16. I think that was the really important thing. And he was just the first writer that everyone has that they fall in love with. Like I felt this intense, kind of emotional, kind of erotic love towards him. And someone who I've kind of carried through really since then.
I'm trying to resist the urge to run to my bookcase and get the collected poems, which has that really beautiful picture of him on the cover.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he's incredibly handsome as well, which helps.
Yeah. I want to ask one last question of all of you, and then maybe ask, look, there's some, see if there's any questions from the audience. Oh, it's just links, basically. As you were speaking, Andrew, I was thinking of something I wanted to talk to Gunnhild about, which is that, no one, when you're going to a wedding or like a engagement party, says, oh, do you have a good love short story that I could read? You're right, it's always a poem. And yeah, poets need some more airtime too, but I guess I wanted to ask you, and I know, Gunnhild, you don't choose topics, you are drawn backwards, falling into a kind of experiment, which then you create solutions for, and that becomes the story or something like that. It's a lot more, it's not issue-based the way, say, an episode of Law and Order or The West Wing is. But are there challenges now to writing about love that maybe you didn't feel 25 years ago or so, when you were first making your own literary start as a poet?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? If there are other,
Yeah, I was sort of juggling and then choosing what was in the air. But basically, I was asking if there are any challenges to writing about love now that weren't in the air when you were just starting out as a poet, or if your sense of what you wanted to write about love has changed.
yeah, well, I'm kind of glad that my sense of what I wanted to write has changed, because if I just wanted to write about what I was writing about when I was 22, I think I maybe wouldn't be here. Yes, of course, but I don't know if it's in the air or if it's in me, if you understand what I mean. It's just, the short story that is in Freeman's now is actually, the way I see it, it's a version of Wade Blink's storyline, which came out in 2008, which is also a relationship between an older writer and a young student. So I just took that theme and made it wider and kind of put their love story aside and tried to explore what would happen much later on in their lives, when the desperate love story wasn't that important anymore. Yes, I think it changes, but I think the challenges of writing are the same now as they have always been, to me anyway. To try to write as good and as as true as I can. When the writer in my story says that he liked the way he'd written this, intimate and honest, I think maybe the story makes a bit fun of it, but it's a kind of a dream to write something that both touches me and also would possibly touch someone else, and how to do that. That's a constant mystery and a constant joy when it happens.
I love the way that this story moves, and I don't want to give anything away. If you haven't read Knots, Andrew, your books are in England. I would love to have them with me too. But the way the story ends moves towards this relationship between its heroine really and her 40-something-year-old daughter, whose name is Sonia, which is the name of a kind of apple tree, which the main character brings home at the end of the story. And you've wrapped this around a poem by Inger Christensen from her great book, if you haven't read it, called Alphabet. And there's some lines in there in which that kind of reflect on the way that an idea grows down and creates shade for itself, or maybe you're in the tree looking down on the idea, and it's this wonderful double-sidedness. I guess you can take this any direction, but do you're a private writer, and you're not a confessionalist. If you were to talk lyrically, you wouldn't move longitudinally into your life and explain. You would elide. But I wonder if you can talk about whether you ever find yourself up in the tree looking down on the ideas of your work and see things that it's told you about yourself, about your life, about love in your life.
Yeah, well, that always happens a couple of years later, and I think I read my books and I think, oh my God, this is everything I felt and everything. It feels very true to myself, and I always feel so shocked to see how clear I can see that it's very close to myself. Oh my God, my latest novel called Presens Maskin is about a mother and a daughter living in parallel universes. The universe split into two when the mother reads a word wrong in a poetry collection. And I think the way it was received in the Norwegian media was that this is a science fiction novel, which is it's a comment to it's a very strong autofiction wave that has been so powerful in Norwegian literature, and of course it was in a way. But what I did was that I took so much of my own life when I had my first child, and I just kind of made it as see-through as possible. I kind of described the apartment where we lived to make it kind of a memory book to myself, because I knew that it wouldn't be, it would never be read as an autobiographical book. So to me, it's full of my own personal memories. That's really not the important thing, you know. And of course, I'm very lucky to not live in a parallel universe where my daughter is not here with me. But it's also, and I also think that, you know, I do tend to write surrealistic or absurdistic short stories, but that's also a way to cope with kind of the pressure of my own life, if you see what I mean. It's just a way of relieving and laughing at it. And also, of course, I was very influenced by Monty Python, which I was kind of watching a lot when I was a teenager. So Monty Python has a lot of blame for this, I think. But it's, yeah, I was thinking actually about the Spanish Inquisition sketch when I was reading this short story again, when they are always entering the room and shouting, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. And I felt like that when I was reading the short story. Oh, okay, I'll just use this way of kind of turning things around and shocking myself.
I want to ask one final question of Andrew, and then one of Mariana, and then you know, if anyone has a question, please put it in the chat. Let's see, someone's asking, can we have a few snippets to be read aloud? That's actually a great idea. I mean, I think the snippets would be far more interesting than my questions, because these are really, really lovely texts. Mariana, do you have, no, you don't have the text. Well, I'll just ask you a question. And maybe Andrew, do you have the text handy?
Yeah, I've got the poem.
Okay. Do you want to read a section of the poem?
Yeah, I can do. I just read a couple of the sections of it, John. Will that be all right?
Yeah, that's great.
Fine. So yeah, so Swan, and then it's in 8 parts. In fact, I said 7, but it's 8. I forgot a part, and it's just kind of the story of Swan Lake, really kind of overlaid over this mental health crisis. So 1, the lake is calm tonight. The moon has dropped white feathers on the water. Tonight, the lake is calm. The wavelets lap like rustling wings. The lake tonight is calm. But look, who is coming in to land to tear the peace asunder. 7, mother